Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about linguistics and miscommunication. So just two disclaimers before we start. Disclaimer number one is that there are lots of ways to miscommunicate besides just language, but I'm going to be focusing on language since this is a linguistics course and that's what I know. And disclaimer number two is that miscommunication is not necessarily something that's normally focused on in linguistics. So it's not normally something that you'll see a class about, right? So linguistics is normally quite formal. So we all recall the IPA from phonetics, um, and we struggled with figuring out how to make correct syntax trees in the syntax unit. And then in pragmatics, we saw the Gricean maxims, which were a little bit less formal, but still pretty formal. And this was probably the closest that we got to directly talking about miscommunication, right? So we kind of talked about how you could use the maxims to mislead people, but that's about it. And if you move on in linguistics, this is what you will continue to see, right? Is not really this direct focus on talking about miscommunication. But what I want to get across to you today is that linguistics actually has a lot to say on this topic. And my research is focused on aspects of language that are able to show us something about why miscommunication might occur. So today I am going to try to show you one, what linguistics can tell us about miscommunication. That is what ways we can take concepts from linguistics and apply these to understanding something about miscommunication. I also want to show you that we're really bad at miscommunication. So there's a lot of people who think that the way that language works is that they get, some kind of concept in their mind that they want to communicate. They find some words that point to that concept. They say the words, and then the other person just gets it. And if they don't get it, then that's on them. That's their fault. This is a really common attitude, actually. But of course, it's not true. And then the last thing that I want to show you is that miscommunication happens in lots of different ways in language at lots of different levels. And basically, that language is not really built to be a clear, unambiguous communication system. So, sort of the big question for me, and something that I've been thinking about for about a decade now, even before I was interested in linguistics or before I even knew it existed, was how is it that we can think we're speaking clearly and still be misunderstood? What is it about language that allows for this to happen? And so today we'll be looking at three basic levels of miscommunication. And sort of another third disclaimer, these aren't levels that are like written down in a book or in a theory anywhere. This is just how I'm choosing to divide up this lecture. So the levels are linguistic, meaning the words and the grammar itself, sort of cognitive levels, so how aspects of our brains and minds interact with language to make it, to make us not very good at communicating, basically. And then also some social and cultural aspects of miscommunication. So, first, let's talk about linguistic aspects of miscommunication. So, the first part of what we're going to see is kind of stuff that we've seen before. So, we saw that there is syntactic and structural ambiguity, right? So, we're going to talk about ambiguity first. And this was one type that we looked at, right? So this is the idea that there are two or more meanings for one sentence. And so if somebody gives you this order and you want to follow it, right, where the order is put the book on the table in the living room, um, what do you picture in your mind when someone says that sentence to you? Because there's actually, as we saw, two different things you could picture, right? It could be that there's a book on a table and you're supposed to put that book into the living room somewhere, maybe on those shelves in the background. Or it could be that there's some book, some relevant book in the context, and you're supposed to put that on the table where the table's in the living room. Okay, and we also saw lexical ambiguity, right? So this is the idea that there are two or more meanings for one word. So for example, if someone says, I saw a building with a huge bat on it, that would fit equally well with either one of these pictures. Now you might think, okay, but like these aren't really ways that you probably tend to miscommunicate because you can always clarify on these things, right? It's pretty obvious when you're having a miscommunication about it, and you can just ask the person, like, hey, do you mean like an animal bat or like a baseball bat, right? Or did you mean the book that's on the table over there, or did you mean some other book and you want me to put it on the table in the living room? But all the other words are safe, right? Like there's all these unambiguous words like cat and tree, words that, normally only have kind of one meaning. And so aren't these words the same for everyone? Well, kind of, right? So we do have a formalism for semantics as well. So what you'd learn in a semantics class is that if you wanted to say something like Max is a cat, you would have something like this. I think you can see my mouse. Okay, so you'd have something like this. So cat with a capital C, parentheses, Max. This translates in our formalism to something like Max is a cat. And we just kind of leave it there, right? But we don't typically talk more about like what the word cat actually means and how it gets its meanings. But connotations, representations, experiences with words are going to differ from person to person. So, a cat could be any of these things on the left here. And so for me personally, I grew up with cats as pets. And so my kind of idea of a cat is something like this one on the left here. This is kind of my prototypical cat. But for someone who grew up in an environment where there weren't any domestic cats, might have something totally different, right? Like maybe a tiger or a lion or a bobcat, I don't know. But it could be something totally different. And then even for someone who grew up with domestic cats around might just have different feelings towards them. So their kind of prototype of a cat or their basic image of a cat might be something more like this bottom one. And the same thing goes for trees as well. So this is something that's interesting to think about, right? That we don't normally think about is what comes to mind when you hear a simple word like cat, and how does that differ from what comes to mind for other people when they hear the word cat? What are the emotional responses? What are the experiences that are being called to mind? All those sorts of things. And yeah, so you might think, okay, well, sure, we differ on like our exact connotations, our exact experiences with words, but those are kind of emotional things. And when there are things that are not emotional, like basic sets of instructions, then there should be no issue, right? So here's a fun activity that normally I would ask you to do in class, and that, since I'm recording this as a video, we can't do together. But I'm putting it in here in case you want to do it with a friend, a roommate, a family member. And if you don't, then I'm just going to kind of explain to you how it works and what the usual outcome is when you do this with a class. So the way that this works is that you get into groups of 2 to 4 people, and you pick one of those people to be the director. And then everyone who's not the director gets a piece of paper and a pen. And then the non-directors are supposed to look away at this point. So they're not supposed to see the next slide, and the director sees the next slide. So if you're doing this, I'm going to just go ahead and pause here for a moment and figure out everybody's role, okay? All right, I'm going to move on now. So this is the way that it works. The director, you are being shown this image, and your job is just to give good verbal instructions to your teammates. And the goal is that you're doing this well enough that they can reproduce this image that you are being shown. So you can say anything you want, and your teammates can ask any questions that they want, but you only have 5 minutes to do it. So if you're doing it, go ahead. The rest of us, let's just move on, and I'll explain what normally happens. So what normally happens when you do this is that the drawings don't look anything like this original drawing. You might get kind of one person in a class of 40 that produces something that looks like the original drawing, but it's actually very, very difficult to do. So even with sort of simple directions, stuff that's not emotional at all, as soon as you try to communicate about something that's a little bit abstract, it's very, very difficult. All right, so let's move on to some stuff that we haven't covered before as much. So cognitive aspects of miscommunication. Okay, oh, I lied. We actually did cover some of this stuff. So I'll just skim over it for you. So hopefully you all remember the cooperative principle, right? So this is the idea that we're cooperating when we're speaking, and there are these kind of rules we assume people are following in a conversation. And because we know that they're following those rules, or because we're assuming that they're following those rules, we kind of know how to expect that they're going to act in conversation. And this is what allows us to get implicatures, really, right? We are able to get certain inferences about what they must have meant because we know what they said and we know how they were probably acting when they said it, meaning they were probably trying to be cooperative and trying to follow these rules. And so just a quick review, in case you want to see it, here are the Gricean maxims again. So, don't lie, give the right amount of information, be relevant, don't say totally off topic things, and be direct. And we also saw that people can break these rules, and they do break them, right? So we talked about how they can uncooperatively break the rule, which is called violating it. And that is doing stuff like just straight up lying, for example, rambling on and on, being totally off topic, like saying something just out of the blue because you weren't really listening to what the other person said and you don't really care what they were saying. Those are all uncooperative ways to break the Gricean maxims. But you can also do this cooperatively, and that's called flouting a rule. So sarcasm is an example of this, and so is being indirect in order to be polite. So for example, if you go shopping with your friend and they try on a shirt and they say, "Hey, do you think this shirt looks good on me?" You could say something like, "Well, I really like the other shirt better." And, technically speaking, you are breaking the maxim of manner here, right? You're not being direct. You are kind of being weird and roundabout, but it's for a function, which is to be polite, right? It would be a lot ruder if you said, "No, I think it looks terrible on you." Not usually how we communicate with one another. And the point of flouting a rule is that you're doing it where the other person, you're doing it openly. You're openly breaking the rule, and they're supposed to understand that you're breaking it and come to a conclusion about why. Right? So the implicature then is the non-literal meaning, as we heard before, of the sentence that you understand based on whatever the context is and the idea that the other person is trying to cooperate with you. So this is the story we normally hear about the cooperative principle and the Gricean maxims. But as I think we touched on in lecture earlier, implicatures don't always just go straight through. And if you continue in linguistics, you'll see that this is how it's talked about, that some particular sentence has a certain implicature, and we kind of talk about it in this idealized situation where we just assume that it goes through perfectly, that the speaker and listener communicate perfectly, the listener understands exactly what the speaker meant to implicate, and that the speaker really meant to implicate that, right? But in practice, this is not true. So for example, text is somewhere where this comes up a lot. So for example, what do you think the implicatures are of answering a text canceling plans by just saying K, period, right? So imagine that you and your friend have plans to go out together, they're really excited, and then the day of, you text them and you say, "Hey, I'm really sorry to cancel, but I'm just actually not feeling up to it. Do you mind if we postpone things until next weekend?" And then they just write back, "K, period." What do you think that means, right? Or what if you send a text to someone and they just send you an ellipses, like dot, dot, dot back? What does that mean? These are ones that I personally have noticed. And I think that they both look really passive aggressive, and it looks like the other person is, pissed. But in both cases, I've had people say like, "No, that's not what I meant at all." In the first case with just saying like K dot, they just mean like, "All right, and I'm going to go do something else." Like, I'm not going to send you a big message about it. I'm just saying, okay. And in the case of the ellipses, what the person said to me was, "Oh, well, I was just thinking. So I sent you an ellipses so that you could tell that I was just thinking." Now, this is something that especially comes up intergenerationally, right? That especially in text communication, there seem to be unintended implicatures, particularly between different generations. So here's a cool article. This is an NPR article by Danny Hensel called "Are Your Texts Passive Aggressive? The Answer May Lie in Your Punctuation." And so here is an excerpt from it. The Denver-based writer had sent her school-aged son a text message about logistics, coming home from school. I could tell from his response that he was agitated all of a sudden in our thread. And when he came home, he walked in the door and he came over and he said, "What did you mean by this?" Rooks was confused. How could an innocuous text message send confusion? And so we looked at the text together and I said, "Well, I meant see you later or something. I don't remember exactly what it said." And he said, "But you ended with a period. I thought you were really angry." Right? So this is something that has actually been talked about a lot. The fact that older generations, they grew up mostly without text messaging. And I think this is probably why this has happened, but they just view a period as punctuation. That's just how you write. Whereas for younger generations, probably about 30s and younger, me included, um, we don't usually use periods in text, and so when someone uses one, it kind of stands out, and for whatever reason, it looks like really abrupt. Like we're not expecting it. It looks really abrupt and kind of passive aggressive, right? Okay, so digging a little bit further into the cooperative principle that we learned about earlier in the quarter. The cooperative principle obviously assumes speakers are cooperative. And something that is really important to this idea is the idea that we are tailoring our speech to other people, right? So we're trying to cooperate, we're trying to work with the other person, and we are thinking about how, if we're the speaker, how they are going to take what we're saying. And if we're the listener, what their perspective was and what they probably were intending based on what they said. But some people, for example, this Kaiser 2007 paper, have argued that communication is actually very egocentric. In general, when people communicate, they're not at all considering the perspective of their conversation partner. They're not thinking about their thoughts or feelings. Um, or at least this is something that is not happening automatically. So a little bit of background for you from psychology. Um, until age 4, children's thinking is egocentric, meaning that they basically focus on their own viewpoint and they assume that kind of everybody else has that viewpoint. So a very well-known task in psychology is called the false belief task. And it works something like this. So you have a child participant come in and they go with an experimenter who we'll call Sally. They go into a room together and they hide a piece of candy together. And then Sally leaves the room, at which point the child is asked to take that piece of candy from its hiding space and move it somewhere else. Now, the interesting thing is that if you do this with a child about age 4 and under, if you ask them, "Hey, Sally's going to come back into the room, where do you think she's going to look for the candy?" The child will think that Sally is going to look for it in the new place, and not in the place that they had originally hidden the candy together. So they don't understand that Sally doesn't have access to the same knowledge that they do. And it's only around age 4 when children begin to understand that, oh, Sally's still going to look for that candy in the old location. She doesn't know that I moved it, right? And so this is typically talked about in terms of a move from egocentric to allocentric thinking. Allocentric just meaning a focus on someone else. So the idea is that we start out focusing on our own thoughts and feelings and perspectives, and then once we hit about age 4, we start considering other people's thoughts and feelings and perspectives. However, there have been some studies that suggest that we're not actually all that good at this. So for example, there's this cool Epley, Morwedge, Kaiser gaze tracking study from 2004. And gaze tracking just means that they had a machine that was like following their eyes and seeing what they were looking at. And the way that it worked was that they had a director who was an experimenter, and they would sit the participant across from the director at a table. And in one part of the table, there would be a screen blocking part of the view. And on the participant side of the table, there would be 3 objects of different sizes. So for example, a small truck, a medium truck, and a large truck. And the small truck would be behind the screen so that the director couldn't see it. And the participant was explicitly told, hey, the director cannot see the small truck. They're not going to ask you to move it. They don't know it's there. So if we were really good at considering other people's perspectives, what we would expect in this experiment is that no matter what, the participant would not move this truck, right? Even if they are told by the director, hey, move the small truck, they should understand, oh, the director, so this is the small truck for me, but the director can't see it. So when they say move the small truck, they must mean this one, because for them, the medium truck is the small truck. Okay, so make sure that you understand how this is supposed to work before you move on to the next slide. Okay, so what they actually found was that this is not what people did. So when the director told participants to move the small truck, which again, for the director would have been this medium-sized truck since they can't see the small one, adults still reached for the truck that they were told the director could not see and was not aware of before reaching for anything else 21% of the time. And about 80% of the adults in their study did this at least once. And I don't have this on the slides, but they actually, I'm fairly certain that they actually, everyone basically actually looked at the small truck first, even if they didn't reach for it. Basically, everyone first looked at the truck that was a small truck for them. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's not very fair because, like, come on, this small truck is just really, really tempting. When someone says move the small truck, you just kind of have an impulse to reach for it. So they reran the experiment where instead of a small truck and a medium truck and a large truck, they had two small trucks and a large truck. So it looked like this. But when they did this, adults were just as likely to reach for the hidden truck as the other one. And in these cases, they often said, which truck? So obviously, what the study suggests is that we're not actually very good about thinking about other people's perspectives in conversation. Okay, now let's move on to level 3, social and cultural aspects of miscommunication. So first, I want to talk about registers. So a register is a concept from sociolinguistics, and it is a way of speaking that is associated with some particular group and the people in that group. So yeah, some particular subculture. So for example, lawyers and legalese, right? The sort of language that's used in courts. Sports commentary, sorry, and sports commentators, they have a very particular way of talking. Military jargon, surfers, YouTubers, TikTokers probably have some kind of jargon, but I wouldn't know because I'm not on TikTok. But it doesn't have to refer to like completely separate groups of people. It can also refer to a single person's differing ways of speaking across contexts. So for example, you most likely use a different register to speak to your professors than you do to speak to your friends. So even the professors that you think are really cool, that you're really comfortable with, you probably don't talk to them just the exact same way as your friends. And that's a reflection of the different registers that you're using. And similarly, you would probably use a different register for someone who's interviewing you for a job than you would for, when you're talking to your sibling. Okay. Now, registers often use jargon, which just means specialized terms, specific words that, are typically used in that register, and it might be specific to that register. Now, jargon is really interesting because it has the function of, marking you as an insider if you know it, but it also keeps outsiders out. So if you don't have access to that jargon, then you are very clearly marked as an outsider to what that particular social group, right? And one important and interesting one, I think, because I think it's something that we can all relate to, is the register that's used in academic English. So the reason that I bring this up is because I think it's a common experience for us. And I just think that it's important to understand what effect not having access to a register can have on you. So um, all of us speak our first languages just fine, right? And we might even speak a second or third language just fine. But what happens when you're forced to speak, read, or write in a register that you're not comfortable with, right? So think about, like, have you ever struggled with reading an academic paper or with talking to someone who's speaking much more formally than you? That struggle you're feeling to communicate is basically your lack of access to that register, right? So um, you can also think about it in terms of, like, how easy is it for you to communicate in academic English, to read an academic article or to try to write one, versus how easy is it for you to communicate talking to your friends? And also, what might happen when you have people from two different registers trying to communicate with one another? Um, how can miscommunication occur there? Another thing that we talked about a little bit earlier is text miscommunication, right? So um, this is an interesting one because, for a long time, writing was something that happened asynchronously. So you would write something and then way later, someone would read it. It wasn't something that was supposed to be back and forth like a conversation in the way that it is now. But even though text communication can take place in real time, it is not like a face to face conversation. So, something else that is interesting to think about is what are some of the things that are lost in text that we have access to with in person spoken or signed language, right? So, um, one of the things that often gets talked about and that I think about a lot is intonation. So, here's another fun activity that I'm not going to really go over, but basically, I still put it in the slides in case you want to try this out with your friends or family. But the way that it basically works is that you get a bunch of pieces of paper and then you write down one sarcastic statement and one sincere one about these topics that I've listed. And then you just mix them up in a hat together, and then people take turns pulling those pieces of paper out of the hat and trying to guess if they're sincere or sarcastic. And again, people tend to be quite confident that they have successfully communicated sincerity or sarcasm, but actually this is something that we're typically very bad at, unless for the sarcastic ones um, you know make it really really obviously sarcastic and use really hyperbolic language. It's not that clear. Okay, the last topic, I think this is the last topic that I want to talk about, is intercultural miscommunication, which is unfortunately probably the area I know the least about, but a really, really cool one. So I wanted to include it in this lecture. So there's a great paper, Tannen, 1984, where she talks about how cultures differ in a number of ways. I think it was 8, but it may have been more, in terms of what's expected in communication, just meaning like the basic way that you act when you communicate, stuff that you wouldn't maybe normally even think of as being part of language. And so, one of these ways, for example, is when to talk. So some cultures expect that you talk a lot, that you're very talkative, and that there's very little silence between two people. And other cultures expect that there's a lot of silence, that you really don't talk that much. And the really interesting and important thing to note about this is that when you have two cultures that differ on these fronts, what you get is cross cultural stereotyping. And this happens over and over again, where you get one talkative culture and one sort of quieter culture. And when they have to interact, the people from the talkative culture will say things about the quieter one, like, oh, they are rude, they're unfriendly, they're sullen, even things like they're stupid. And the relatively quieter culture will say things like, oh, like they're obnoxious, they're loud, they're insincere, because they act like they're your friend, but they're not. And um, so, they're basically, because they have certain expectations about how you're supposed to act when you're talking, and they're applying those to people from another culture who have different basic expectations, they end up thinking that everybody in that culture is, rude or stupid or insincere or hypocritical or whatever it is. And of course, this is not the case. It's just that we're kind of starting from fundamentally different places. Now, another one is pacing and pausing. So this refers to, how quickly should you speak in a conversation? How long do you have to wait after someone has spoken before you can assume that it's your turn? And this is something that can differ, between people in one culture, but across cultures as well. And even a slight difference in expectation here can lead to one person just totally dominating the conversation. So we've probably all experienced this where, we're in a conversation with someone and we keep waiting to talk, and they just like talk and talk and talk and talk. And the pauses between, um, you know, sentences or points that they're making is so short that we never feel like we can get a word in edgewise, that's because of a difference in expectation for pacing and pausing. And then another really cool one that for me is very noticeable is intonation, right? So intonation differs across languages as well. And so there was a really interesting study. This is Gumper's 1982, and it was a study of airport cafeteria workers in London. And this is a really cool study, but it's a little bit complicated for me to explain, but I'll do my best. So the way it worked was that there was there were cafeteria workers in an airport in London, and they were a mix of British, Indian, and Pakistani, and maybe others as well, but they didn't really talk about that. They were only talking about these three groups. Okay, and they were serving the airport workers. Okay, so this was a cafeteria that served airport workers. And so there was this problem where the staff was complaining. So the staff that came to the airport were complaining that the Indian and Pakistani cafeteria workers were rude. Meanwhile, the Indian and Pakistani cafeteria workers were complaining that they were being discriminated against, that they were being treated badly just because they were Indian or just because they were Pakistani. So what they did in this study was that they recorded just a bunch of footage from the cafeteria. So they recorded all these interactions between the workers and the staff. And then they had the cafeteria workers watch the tapes back together. And so what would happen is that the airport workers would come down the cafeteria line and they would be given meat and potatoes and vegetables or something like this. And then the the cafeteria workers were supposed to offer them gravy. And so the British workers would do this by holding out the ladle of gravy and saying, "Gravy?" Meanwhile, the Indian and Pakistani workers would hold out the ladle of gravy and say, "Gravy." Okay, so when they got to this point in the tapes, the Pakistani and Indian workers pointed at it and they said, "There, why did we get such a bad reaction? We said the exact same thing as the British workers said, and they got totally fine reactions from the airport staff." And then what the British cafeteria workers said in response to this was, "Well, yeah, you said the same thing, but it's the way that you said it, right?" So what went wrong here? This was a problem of intonation. So for English speakers, at least most English speakers, we expect that when you are offering someone something, you kind of phrase it like a question, right? You say, "Gravy?" But this apparently was not an expectation for the Indian and Pakistani workers. And so they just said gravy. But to the British airport workers, this sounded really rude, right? It sounds something like you're forcing the gravy on them or something, or you're telling them they have to take it. And so there's this really great quote that came out of this article, which is, "When intonational business as usual is mistaken for emotional expression, the result is miscommunication." In other words, you know, when you think that someone is using their intonation to express some kind of emotion, and it's actually just the way that that thing is always expressed in that language, and they're not expressing any emotion at all, you're going to misunderstand them. So the takeaway from this is that there are very different expectations across cultures and language groups for all sorts of things about language. And if you find yourself noticing that like X group of people always talks in some way that you think is like rude or abrupt, or that all of them act over friendly or under friendly or whatever when you're having conversations with them, you can probably assume, um, or you should at least consider that this might be what's going on, that it is not in fact that this whole group of people just has the exact same personality traits, but that it might be something about the language. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is avoiding miscommunication, question mark. So, okay, we might be kind of inherently egocentric in the ways that we speak, but maybe we can do something about it, right? So maybe we can anticipate and avoid possible miscommunications. Well, there was a study, Horton and Kaiser in 1996, that suggested that speakers are trying to tailor their speech for listeners. So in this study, participants played a communication game. And the way that it worked was that there would be two participants, a speaker and a listener, and they would both be seated at computer screens, but they could not see each other's screens. And the speaker's job was to try to describe an object that would appear first on their screen, and then it would disappear from their screen and appear on the listener's. So, okay, there were two different conditions or two different basic ways that this would occur. So in condition one, where is my mouse? There it is. In condition one, okay, so this is supposed to be a representation of the two screens. This is the listener's screen on the left. This is the speaker's screen on the right. And this top image represents like some earlier time, and then this bottom image represents some later time. So in condition one, there was this big black circle that appeared on both the listener and the speaker's screens the entire time. It was just always there. And the speaker starts out with this smaller circle on their screen, and then it disappears from their screen and it moves on to the listener's screen. Now, importantly, the speaker knows that the listener can also see this circle. So they know that they have some shared context. In the other condition, it worked exactly the same way, except this time the speaker could see this large circle, but the listener couldn't. And importantly, the speaker knew that. So again, we start out with the speaker with both of these circles on their screen, the large one and the small one. And then the small one disappears from their screen and it moves to the listener's screen. But this time the listener does not have the large circle on their screen. So glossing over the details of this study, what they found was that when they gave people unlimited time to communicate, the speaker was better at paying attention to the shared context. In other words, they were better at understanding, better at sort of keeping track of whether or not the listener had this large circle to refer to or not. And when they were given limited time to speak, speakers just totally forgot whether or not the listener had that thing on their screen, and they might accidentally refer to the large circle that they could see that the listener couldn't. So they might say something, for instance, like, oh, it's the object above the large circle, right? When the listener actually doesn't have a large circle, and so they don't know what they're talking about. So what this suggests is that speakers are fundamentally egocentric, but if you give them enough time and the wind's blowing the right way and they've eaten enough lunch, then they will probably get this right. Now, the last point that I want to bring up, or the last couple points, I guess, is that I just want to leave you with a few questions. And normally we would get to discuss this in class, but I will just let you think about them. So the first question is, given what we've talked about today, all the ways in which miscommunication can happen in language, but also, our general inclination to try to be cooperative, do you think that anything can be done to avoid miscommunication? What are the best things we can do to make sure that we are actually communicating with people properly? The second question, which I think is really helpful to think about, is how much of the time do you think you have been misunderstood when you thought you were communicating clearly? Or how much of the time do you think you might have misunderstood something and didn't even notice? And then the last question, which is sort of a very unhelpful question to ask because I don't know how you're supposed to answer it, is if language is something we use for communication, why is it so easy to miscommunicate? And I guess by asking this question, I am trying to get you to think more about, we learn all of these different cool formal things in linguistics, but how can we apply them to understanding things like miscommunication or even to other things in the world, right? And that's all. Thanks. Now I just have to figure out how to close this.